Colonel Darren Howell slammed his hand on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled to the floor. "She doesn't belong on this range," he said, his voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. "I don't care what her file says. A logistics officer pulling a trigger on my range over my dead body." He turned to the men around him, his lip curled into something between contempt and amusement. 13 SEALs couldn't hit that target, and now we're letting the supply clerk try. The laughter that followed was ugly. It was the kind of laugh that had ended careers, the kind that had broken people. But Captain Sarah Langford had already heard that laugh before, and she had already decided it would never break her again. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Sarah's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning started the way most mornings at Fort Carver did, with dust diesel fumes and the low rumble of diesel engines hauling equipment across the base perimeter. The Arizona sun had already climbed high enough to make the air shimmer above the asphalt. By 6:30, the temperature on the southern range was hovering near 94 degrees and it was still climbing. Captain Sarah Langford noticed none of it. She was already 3 hours into her shift reviewing supply manifests for a shipment of communications equipment that had gone missing somewhere between a warehouse in Tucson and the secondary depot at the base's eastern edge. She had a coffee mug on her desk, cold untouched. She had a pen behind her ear and a highlighter in her hand, and she was cross-referencing 2 separate inventory logs with the quiet, focused intensity of someone who understood that details were never small. Details were the difference between a mission succeeding and men dying in the field waiting for equipment that never arrived. She was 38 years old, 12 years in the Army. She had a face that people described as serious, not unfriendly. Just serious, the kind of face that didn't smile unless there was something worth smiling about. Her hair was pulled back, her uniform was pressed, her boots were clean. None of that would matter in about 4 hours. At 10:15, her radio crackled. It was Sergeant First Class Danny Reeves, her logistics NCO, a good man, reliable 20 years in and still capable of surprising her. "Captain Langford," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge he got when something unusual was happening on base. "You might want to come down to range 7. She looked up from her manifest. "Why, General Reed is out there. He's got the SEAL sniper team running quals. Something's happening." She paused. "Something?" "Yeah, 13 of them, all missed the 4,000 mark. General's not happy." She was quiet for a moment. Her pen moved slightly between her fingers, just a small rotation, a habit she'd had since she was a girl, something she did when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't sure she should say out loud. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She didn't tell Reeves why. She didn't tell anyone. Range 7 was the longest qualification range on the installation. It stretched out from a raised firing line across a flat expanse of desert scrub and heat-blasted rock until it terminated at a target set nearly 4 kilometers away. At that distance, the target was invisible to the naked eye. It existed only as a set of coordinates, a mathematical problem dressed up to look like an object. The conditions on that range were never kind. The heat distortion alone could bend a shooter's perception enough to throw around several feet off course. And on a day like today, with the wind shifting unpredictably out of the southwest and the temperature still rising, it was the kind of range that separated genuine craft from everything else. 13 men had already stood on that firing line. 13 of them had gone through the calculations, settled into their positions, controlled their breathing, squeezed their triggers. 13 of them had waited the 4+ seconds it took for a bullet to travel that distance. 13 of them had heard the range officer's radio crackle with the same flat deflating report miss. General Marcus Reed stood behind the firing line with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that his staff had learned to recognize. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder than anger. It was disappointment folded inside frustration, and the combination of those two things in a man like Reed was far more unsettling than a raised voice would have been. He was 61 years old, 34 years in the Army. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by things most people only read about: 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Somalia, a classified operation in Syria that he was not legally permitted to discuss at any gathering that included journalists or politicians. He had lost men. He had written letters to their families. He had stood at grave sites in full-dress uniform and rendered honors to flag-draped caskets while holding himself together with the sheer force of professional discipline. He was not a man who was easily impressed. He was also not a man who was easily discouraged. But standing behind this firing line, watching his 13th shooter pick himself up off the mat and walk away from the position without a confirmed hit, something in Reed had quietly shifted. "This is it," he said. He wasn't directing the question at anyone in particular. "This is the best we've got." Colonel Darren Howell, who had been standing slightly behind and to Reed's left for the last 2 hours, cleared his throat. Howell was the installation commander, Reed's host for the day, a man whose career had been built on appearing to be exactly the right size for whatever room he was in. "Sir, the conditions today are exceptional. The crosswind is—" "I know what the crosswind is, Darren." Reed's voice was quiet. That was always the warning sign. "I also know that the conditions our enemies operate in are not going to be negotiated in advance." Howell nodded carefully. "Yes, sir." Reed turned back to the range. The distant target was invisible to him, but he stared in its direction anyway, as if he could will it into focus through sheer determination. That was when he heard the footsteps. Sarah had not intended to make an entrance. She had walked down to range 7 the way she walked everywhere, directly at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be. She had signed in at the range control point, shown her credentials to the sergeant on duty, and walked to the observation area behind the firing line. She had fully planned to stand there, quietly watch what was happening, and leave without saying a single word to anyone. She had not fully planned for Colonel Howell to notice her. "Langford?" His voice was sharp. "What are you doing out here? This is a closed qualification event." Several of the men on the firing line turned to look at her. Sarah recognized some of them. She'd processed equipment requests for a few of the SEAL teams before knew their faces from briefings and hallway crossings. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to the specific kind of condescension that comes naturally to men who have decided without investigation that a person is not worth their attention. "I'm observing, sir," Sarah said. Her voice was even. "My credentials were cleared at the gate." "Your credentials are for range access during training hours." "This is Colonel." General Reed had turned around. He looked at Sarah with the same measuring gaze he turned on everything, not unfriendly, not warm, simply assessing. "Do I know you, Captain?" "No, sir," Sarah said. "I don't believe we've met directly." "What's your role on this installation?" "Logistics, sir. Supply chain management and equipment coordination." Reed nodded slowly. "Logistics." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the distant target a moment ago, like he was trying to calculate something. "You heard about our problem out here?" "I heard the radio traffic, sir, yes." "And you came to watch him?" There was a pause. It was short, maybe 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, something happened inside Sarah Langford that she had been suppressing for a very long time. A door that she kept locked. That she kept locked because it was safer to keep it locked, because the things behind it were complicated and painful, and she had never been entirely sure she had the right to open it, shifted just slightly on its hinges. "No, sir," she said. "I came to shoot." "Sunim." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind moving across the desert scrub 50 yards to her left. Then Howell laughed. It was the laugh she'd expected, the ugly one, the dismissive one, and she heard it echoed quietly by 2 or 3 of the men at the firing line. Captain Howell said, and his tone had shifted into something that was almost amused, almost gentle in the way that condescension sometimes masks itself as patience. "These are Navy SEAL snipers. These are men with hundreds of hours of long-range marksmanship training. They couldn't make this shot today." "What exactly makes you think—" "Permission to speak freely, sir." Sarah looked at General Reed, not at Howell. Reed studied her for a moment, then granted. "With respect, what I think isn't the variable. Either I can make the shot or I can't. The only way to find out is to let me try." She paused. "If I miss, nothing changes. You've lost nothing except 2 minutes." Another silence. Reed looked at her. She looked back at him. Around them, the desert held its breath. "What rifle do you want?" Reed asked. "Mine, sir, if I can go back to my vehicle." Howell stepped forward. "General, with respect, I really don't think this is—" "Darren." Reed's voice was still quiet. It was the same tone he'd used before. "Please stop talking." It took Sarah 8 minutes to walk to the vehicle lot and return. When she came back, she was carrying a rifle case, olive drab, worn at the corners. The kind of case that told you it had been somewhere. She set it on the bench at the firing position and opened it without ceremony. The rifle inside was a .338 Lapua Magnum bolt action, a platform that was in the right hands capable of confirmed kills at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. This one had been carefully modified over years, a custom barrel, a specialized scope, a trigger assembly that had been adjusted to a break weight that Sarah had spent years training her hands to trust. It was not a standard issue weapon. It was something she had built and maintained in private. The way some people keep journals or tend gardens, something personal, something that belonged to a part of herself she didn't often show. One of the SEAL snipers, a man named Kowalski Sr. among the group, with a record that included confirmed kills at ranges that had made military news, looked at the rifle and said nothing for a moment. Then, that's an old platform. Yes, Sarah said, the newer systems have better ballistic compensators for this kind of range. I know, Sarah said. She began attaching the suppressor to the barrel. I prefer this one. Kowalski watched her hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then in a voice that was more honest than his earlier expression had suggested he was capable of, "You've shot at this range before." Not this range specifically, Sarah said. Similar conditions. Where? She looked at him. Elsewhere. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them, some unspoken recognition, and Kowalski stepped back without another word and crossed his arms and waited, which was more courtesy than most of the men behind the line were showing. Sarah settled into the firing position. She spent the first 2 minutes doing nothing that looked like shooting. She lay still, her cheek resting against the stock but not yet pressing into it, and she listened to the wind. She watched the heat shimmer over the range. She had a small notebook beside her, the kind with a spiral binding and graph paper, and she opened it and made several calculations in pencil. Wind speed at the firing line, wind speed at the midpoint, estimated by watching the movement of a stand of desert grass 700 meters out. Temperature, humidity estimated from the feel of the air on her skin. The Coriolis effect correction for a 4,000-meter shot at this latitude. The bullet dropped nearly 860 feet over that distance, a number that would have felt like fiction to anyone who hadn't done the math. What's she writing? Someone said behind her quietly enough that she could pretend she hadn't heard it. Her will, someone else said. The quiet laughter was immediate. Sarah's pencil didn't stop moving. When she finished her calculations, she closed the notebook. She adjusted her position, small, precise adjustments under her elbow placement, her body angle, the elevation of the rifle stock. She pressed her cheek properly against the stock and settled her eye behind the scope. She found the target in the optic at 4,000 meters, and even in the scope, it was small, and through the heat shimmer, it moved and danced like a mirage. She breathed. In, out, in, out. Around her, the range was absolutely silent. Even the men who had been laughing had gone quiet. She exhaled half a breath and held it. She squeezed the trigger. The report was sharp despite the suppressor, a heavy crack that rolled out across the desert and came back a moment later as a faint echo. The rifle moved against her shoulder with the controlled authority of a round, leaving the barrel at nearly 900 meters per second. And then they waited. Because at 4,000 meters, even at that velocity, a bullet needs time. It arcs, it falls, it fights the wind, it fights physics and gravity, and the turning of the earth itself. It travels for just over 4 seconds. 4 seconds that on range 7 felt like a very long time. The radio in the range officer's hand crackled. Everyone heard it. No one breathed. Impact, said the range officer's voice, flat and professional and completely certain. Center mass, confirmed hit. Yeah. For approximately 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Kowalski said quietly and with complete sincerity, "Holy God." It broke the spell. Around the firing line, men began to react, some with stunned silence, some with involuntary exclamations. One of the younger SEAL candidates literally turning in a full circle, as if he needed to confirm with his own eyes that the universe was still operating normally. General Reed stood absolutely still, his arms still crossed, his expression giving away nothing. Howell said, "The equipment. There must be something wrong with the target verification system. Run it again." "Colonel," the range officer said carefully, "the system is functioning normally. The shot was confirmed by 2 independent sensors." "Run it again," Howell repeated. Sarah was already getting up from the firing position. She dusted off the front of her uniform with a single efficient motion, then reached down and closed her rifle case with the same unhurried calm with which she'd opened it. Her hands, if anyone had been close enough to look, were steady. Reed crossed the space between them in 7 steps. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her before, the same measuring quality, but there was something different in it now. Something that had shifted. "Captain Langford," he said. "Sir?" "How long have you been doing this?" She considered the question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the full answer was complicated, and this didn't seem like the right moment for the full answer. "A while, sir," she said. "That's not an answer." "No, dude, it's not." She looked at him directly. "Do you want the real answer or the answer that fits this context?" Reed was quiet for a moment. "Let's start with this context." 17 years, she said, "since I was 21. I taught myself the mathematics first, then the mechanics. I've been practicing on ranges off base for most of my career. In secret. The Army wasn't offering me a spot on a sniper team, sir." The directness of it landed. Reed absorbed it without flinching because it was the truth, and he was the kind of man who recognized the truth when it was placed plainly in front of him. He nodded slowly. "There's something else," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him steadily. "Sir, the way you moved when you set up that shot, the way you read the conditions, that's not just range training." He paused. "Where have you shot in conditions like this?" The wind moved across the range. Somewhere in the distance, one of the range's flagpoles creaked slightly on its mount. Sarah said, "Afghanistan, sir." The word landed in the air between them with a weight that neither of them immediately moved to address. "Afghanistan," Reed repeated. His voice had changed. Something in it had shifted, a recognition maybe, or the first edge of a memory being turned over like a stone. "When but?" "Multiple deployments, sir, though not in any role that was officially documented as marksmanship." Reed studied her face. She watched his expression with the same careful attention she'd given to the wind patterns on the range, reading it, calculating it, understanding that something was happening in this man's memory, something that was moving toward her from a direction she had in fact anticipated for a long time. 2017, Reed said slowly. "Kunar province." Sarah said nothing. "There was an operation," Reed said. "My team was compromised. We were pinned in a ravine for 6 hours. And then at approximately 1400 hours, 3 of the combatants who had us pinned were removed from the equation in rapid succession from an elevated position that no one on my team had secured. We never identified the shooter." He paused. "We assumed it was a CIA asset." Sarah looked at him. The wind moved her collar slightly. Her expression was as it had been all day, serious, not unfriendly, just serious. "Yes, sir," she said. "That's a reasonable assumption." General Marcus Reed looked at the woman standing in front of him. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the men around them began to exchange glances, began to understand that something was happening here that was larger than a qualification, shot on a range in Arizona, larger than 13 misses and 1 confirmed hit, larger than any of the easy narratives they had been constructing in their heads for the past 20 minutes. Then Reed brought his right hand up to the brim of his cap. He held it there, a full formal salute, rendered without hesitation or qualification to a logistics officer with a worn rifle case in her hand and dust on her uniform. "Captain Langford," he said. Around them, the desert was absolutely still. Sarah stood straight and returned the salute. Her eyes did not drop. Her jaw did not tighten. She accepted the salute the way she had accepted everything else today. The laughter, the skepticism, the silence after the shot, with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped needing the world's permission to know her own worth. "Thank you, sir," she said. And somewhere at the far end of Range 7, 4,000 meters away, across the heat and the wind, in the shimmering Arizona desert, a small target stood with a fresh hole punched clean through its center. The salute lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds stretched across Range 7 like something physical, like a current that ran from Reed's hand through the air and landed on every man standing on that firing line with the force of something they hadn't been prepared for. Kowalski was the first to move. He stepped forward, not quickly but deliberately, the way a man moves when he's made a decision and doesn't want to second guess it. He stopped about 2 feet from Sarah, looked at her directly, and extended his hand. "Chief Petty Officer Kowalski," he said, "that was the best shot I've ever seen in person. and I've seen a lot of shots. Sarah shook his hand. Thank you, Chief. I'm not saying it to be polite, Kowalski said. His voice had the flat, no-nonsense quality of a man who spent very little of his life saying things he didn't mean. I'm saying it because it's true and because you deserve to hear it said out loud in front of witnesses. Behind him, two more of the SEAL candidates moved forward, then a third. Not all of them, there were still men at the back of the line who hadn't moved, whose expressions hadn't changed, who were working very hard to find an explanation for what they just witnessed that didn't require them to revise anything they believed. But enough of them moved forward that the gesture meant something. Colonel Howell was not among them. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set, and his eyes doing that particular kind of work that bureaucratic minds do when reality has departed significantly from the version they had been managing. He was already calculating, already constructing the version of this event that would appear in his incident report, his emails, his quietly voiced concerns to people above and below him in the chain of command. Sarah had seen that expression before. She recognized it the way you recognize weather, not because you welcome it, but because you've learned to prepare for what it brings. General Reed noticed Howell's silence. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, without turning his head, without changing his expression, filing it alongside everything else he was processing. He had known Darren Howell for 11 years. He understood entirely what that silence meant. Darren, Reed said, still looking at Sarah. You have something you want to say. Howell cleared his throat. I think we need to talk about the protocols here, sir. The range was designated for a closed qualification event. Captain Langford's participation wasn't authorized through proper channels. There are liability considerations, chain of command questions. She made the shot, Reed said. Yes, sir, she did. But the process failed 13 times this morning. Reed finally turned to look at Howell. The process sent 13 trained shooters to that line and brought 13 of them back without a confirmed hit. And then a logistics officer who wasn't authorized through proper channels walked up and did what none of them could do. He paused. So let's have a slightly more careful conversation about what the process is actually protecting. Howell's mouth closed. He opened it again, then closed it again. He looked in that moment like a man who had arrived at a door he hadn't expected to find locked. Sarah said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you could sometimes do in a room was simply be still and let the truth do its own work. It was Kowalski who broke the silence, and he did it by asking the question that several people had been circling without landing on. Captain Langford, he said, how many shots have you taken at this range or beyond? She looked at him. In controlled conditions or field conditions? Kowalski's eyes moved just slightly. Both. In controlled conditions, ranges practice calibration work, several thousand over 17 years. She paused. In field conditions with a live threat environment and time pressure, the number is smaller. How much smaller? She looked at him for a moment. 11 confirmed, 3 probable. The range went quiet again. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a conversation to end, the genuine quiet of people recalibrating. 14 engagements at extreme range in the field under live fire conditions. Confirmed. That number sat in the air above range 7 and refused to be comfortable. Where? Kowalski said. His voice was lower now. 3 locations, Sarah said. I'm not going to give you the specifics right now. Kowalski nodded. He accepted that with the ease of a man who understood that some answers existed in compartments, and those compartments had locks for reasons. Fair enough, he said. Reed had been watching this exchange without intervening. Now he stepped closer to Sarah. His voice dropped not so low that the men around them couldn't hear, but lower than the register he'd been using. Afghanistan was one of those locations, he said. Yes, sir. Kunar Province, 2017. You were there in what official capacity? Sarah met his eyes. Officially, sir, I was attached to a logistics coordination unit supporting forward operating bases in the eastern sector. And unofficially, sir, I was doing what needed to be done. Reed absorbed that. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that generals are quiet when they're not being quiet for effect, but because they're actually thinking. The operation I'm referring to, he said carefully. My team was 6 men. We'd been compromised by a local informant. We didn't know that until later. We went into that ravine expecting a clear route and found ourselves pinned from 3 elevated positions within about 90 seconds of entry. He stopped. He looked at her. We were going to lose people, Captain. I was certain of it. And then in the space of about 40 seconds, the 3 shooters that had us pinned were removed. Clean shots, no warning, no communication. Whoever was on the trigger knew exactly what they were doing and exactly when to do it. Sarah said, 6 men came home from that ravine, sir. 5 men came home from that ravine, Reed said. His voice had gone very quiet. Sergeant First Class Thomas Webb died of wounds 11 days later at Bagram. The words landed hard. Sarah's expression shifted just slightly, just enough for someone who was paying attention to see it. A tightening around her eyes. Something that moved through her and was controlled before it could fully surface. I know, she said. I know about Sergeant Webb. Reed looked at her. You followed up on us afterward. I followed up on all of them, sir. All 6 of you. I needed to know. She paused. I always need to know. There was something in the way she said that last sentence, a weight to it, a grief that was old and disciplined and not going anywhere that changed the quality of the silence around them again. Kowalski looked at the ground. One of the younger candidates shifted his weight uncomfortably. Even Howell, who had been building his bureaucratic fortress in the background, went still. Reed said, Who authorized your deployments? I can't answer that question on this range, sir. Will you answer it somewhere else? She looked at him steadily. That depends on what you plan to do with the answer. Reed almost smiled. It was a small thing, a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, but it was real. Fair, he said. Come to my temporary office at 1600 hours. We'll talk. He glanced at Howell. Privately. Howell said, Sir, I really think given the circumstances, 1600 hours, Captain, Reed said, looking only at Sarah. Don't be late. Yes, sir. She picked up her rifle case. She nodded to Kowalski, a small, genuine nod, the kind that means more than a handshake sometimes. She walked off the range the way she'd walked onto it directly, at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be. Behind her, she heard Howell's voice start up again low and insistent, and she heard Reed's voice cut across it, and she did not turn around to watch what happened next. She didn't need to. She had been reading rooms and situations and the trajectories of conversations for a very long time. She already knew how this one was going to go. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have calculated even with all her precision, was what she was going to say at 1600 hours. Because the truth of who she was and what she had done and how she had done it was not a clean thing. It was not a story that fit neatly into a briefing format. It was tangled up with decisions she had made in darkness, with permissions that had never existed on paper, with 4 names that she carried with her every single day. 4 names that General Marcus Reed did not yet know. She walked to her vehicle, placed the rifle case in the back, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She had 2 hours and 45 minutes before 1600 hours. She used 4 of those minutes to sit very still and breathe. Then she started the engine and drove back to logistics. She had supply manifests to finish. The missing communications equipment wasn't going to find itself. Inside her head, behind the part of her that was reviewing inventory numbers, the 4 names moved quietly in the dark. Thomas Okafor, James Ritter, Derek Baines, Luis Espinoza. Not ghosts exactly. She had never thought of them as ghosts. Ghosts were things that haunted you. These 4 were different. They were things she carried. Weight you chose to carry because you believed you were supposed to be strong enough to hold it. Because you believed that if you put it down, if you set it somewhere and walked away, you would be abandoning something that deserved better than to be put down. She had been carrying them for 7 years. At 1400 hours, her radio crackled. Reeves. Captain, you have got a message from Colonel Howell's office. He wants to meet before your 1600 with the general. She looked at the radio for a moment. Tell him I'm unavailable until 1600. A pause. He said it's important. Tell him, Sarah said evenly, that I'm sure it is. She clicked off the radio. She looked at the supply manifest in front of her. She picked up her pen. The communications equipment had been rerouted through a secondary depot and mislabeled as training materials. It took her 12 more minutes to locate it in the system. She filed the correction, flagged it for Reeves to action, and closed the folder. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job. Both of them. At 15:40, she walked to the building where Reed's temporary staff had set up offices. She was 20 minutes early. She sat in the hallway outside the door and waited her back, straight, her hands still. At 15:58, the door opened. Reed's aide, a young captain named Foster, who had the alert, slightly overwhelmed look of someone who spent most of his time trying to keep a general's schedule from collapsing under its own weight, looked at her and said, "General Reed will see you now, Captain." She went in. Reed was standing behind a desk that wasn't his temporary furniture, temporary space. The kind of setup that followed senior officers around on field visits like a portable version of authority. He had his jacket off. He was in shirt sleeves. He looked without the jacket like what he actually was, under all the rank a man in his 60s who had spent most of his life doing hard things and was still doing them. "Close the door," he said. She did. She took the chair across from him without being asked because he hadn't asked, and she decided some time ago that she was done performing uncertainty she didn't feel. She set nothing on the desk between them. No notes, no files. She had whatever she needed in her head. Reed sat. He looked at her. "Darren Howell is going to file a formal complaint," he said. "He's going to say that your presence on Range 7 today was unauthorized, that it created a liability situation, and that the verification of your shot result needs to be reviewed by an independent observer before it can be entered into any official record." "I know," Sarah said. "He's also going to make some phone calls this evening to people in personnel and in the Inspector General's office." "I know that too." Reed leaned back slightly. "You don't seem concerned." "I'm concerned," she said. "I'm just not surprised. There's a difference." Reed looked at her for a moment. "Tell me about the 4 you lost." The sentence landed without warning. No preamble, no softening. Just the direct placement of the thing she had been carrying for 7 years into the center of the space between them, where it could no longer be carried quietly. It was the most startling thing he had said all day. More startling than the salute, more startling than the recognition of Kunar Province, because it meant that in the hours since Range 7, Reed had done more digging than she'd expected. She was quiet for a moment, a long moment, long enough that another person might have read it as reluctance. It wasn't reluctance. It was the kind of pause that happens when you have to decide not which words to use, but whether you are actually ready to put the weight down and let another person see how heavy it has been. "Thomas Okafor," she said. "James Ritter, Derek Baines, Luis Espinoza." She said each name at its full length with full weight. "They were my team, unofficially, in the same way I was there unofficially." She paused. They were 23, 25, 26, and 27 years old. Reed said nothing. He waited. "We were supporting an extraction in Kunar. Different operation from yours earlier February of that year. The intelligence on the route was bad. We went in on a timeline that someone above us had approved without running it by anyone who actually understood the terrain." Her voice was steady. This was not the first time she had said these words. She had said them to herself in the dark many times. "We hit an ambush at a choke point. I was in an elevated position I'd set up early, the way I always did. I could see the choke point. I could see what was coming. I had 30 seconds of warning and a radio that was being jammed." She stopped. "I took 3 of the ambush team before the explosion. The other 2 reached the choke point before I could re-engage." She stopped again. Thomas, James, Derek, Luis, they were in the vehicle. Reed sat forward. His elbows came to the desk. He looked at her with the kind of focused, absolute attention that stripped everything else from the room. "That wasn't your failure, Captain?" "No," she said. "It wasn't, I know that." She looked at him directly. "I also know that knowing something isn't the same as being done carrying it. And I am not done carrying it. I don't know if I'll ever be done." She paused. "What I can do is make sure that what I know, the math, the mechanics, the patience, the reading of conditions, gets passed on to people who will use it correctly, so that the next time someone is in a choke point with bad intelligence and a jammed radio, there are more shooters in elevated positions, and they're better, and they have more time." The room was very quiet. Reed looked at her for a long time. "That's why you wanted to shoot today," he said. "It wasn't about proving something." "No," Sarah said. "It was about being seen, because you can't teach what no one knows you know." Reed was quiet for another moment. Then he opened the desk drawer in front of him and took out a folder. He set it on the desk between them and pushed it toward her. She looked at it. She didn't open it yet. That's a proposal, Reed said. I drafted the outline this afternoon. It establishes a new long-range marksmanship instruction program under the Army's Advanced Training Directorate. It needs a lead instructor. He paused. It needs someone who understands the math and the mechanics and the patience and the reading of conditions, and who understands what it costs when those things aren't good enough. Sarah looked at the folder. She looked at Reed. Howell, she said. Howell doesn't run the Advanced Training Directorate, Reed said. I do. She picked up the folder. She opened it. She read the first page in silence, then the second. Her expression as she read was the same serious, focused expression she wore at the firing line, not performing calm. Actually calm because she was processing information, and that was a task that required clarity. When she finished the second page, she looked up. There are 4 names on the dedication line, she said. Yes, Reed said. I thought there should be. Something moved across Sarah Langford's face. It was brief, a few seconds at most, and it was one of the rare moments in which the discipline she had built over 17 years stepped aside just slightly and let something genuine through. Not grief exactly, not relief. Something that existed in the territory between those two things. Something that happens when a weight you've been carrying alone is for the first time acknowledged by another person as real and significant and worth honoring. She set the folder down. She straightened it carefully on the desk. I'll need to review the full proposal, she said, and I'll need assurances about the program's independence from installation-level command. Meaning Howell. Meaning anyone whose primary concern is process over outcome. Reed nodded slowly. I'll get you those assurances. Then we have something to talk about, Sarah said. Outside the building, the Arizona sun was beginning its descent. The shadows on the base were lengthening. Somewhere across the installation, Range 7 was going quiet for the evening. The target at 4,000 meters, standing in the fading light, with its new mark patient, and still waiting for the next person who thought they understood what it meant to make an impossible shot. Most of them would be wrong. Sarah Langford already knew that. She had known it for 17 years. And now for the first time she had been given a room in which to teach it. The folder sat on Sarah's desk the next morning. She had taken it home, which was technically irregular classified material in a personal vehicle, but Reed had handed it to her without a classification marker, and she had decided that was intentional. He was a man who made very few mistakes. If he hadn't marked it, he hadn't marked it on purpose. She had read it 3 times before midnight. Then she had set it on her kitchen table and made coffee and sat with it in the way she sat with difficult problems, not trying to solve them, just letting them exist in front of her while her mind worked through the angles. The program Reed was proposing was serious. It wasn't a gesture. It wasn't a training annex or a supplemental curriculum stapled to an existing sniper certification course. It was a full independent program, 12 weeks, small cohorts, a combination of mathematical ballistics instruction and live fire development that started at 500 meters and built methodically to distances that most military shooters never trained at in their careers. It had a budget line. It had a staffing structure. It had Reed's name attached to it as the authorizing officer, which meant it had institutional protection that a program with anyone else's name on it would not have had. It also had on the 3rd page a personnel requirement that had kept Sarah awake longer than anything else in the document. The lead instructor would be required to formally transfer out of logistics. Full reclassification. New MOS, new chain of command, new everything. 17 years of working in the space between what she was officially and what she actually was, and this program would end that. It would make her on paper what she had only ever been in practice. She wasn't sure how she felt about that, which surprised her because she had spent 17 years believing that recognition was what she wanted, that being seen was the thing she was working toward. She was still sitting with that surprise when her phone rang at 0645. Private number. She answered it anyway. Captain Langford. The voice was not one she recognized immediately. Male mid-range with the specific flatness of someone who had learned to remove all interpretable affect from his speaking voice. My name is not important right now. What is important is that you received a document yesterday afternoon from General Reed. She set down her coffee cup very carefully. I'm listening. That document describes a program that will not receive final authorization. I want you to understand that before you make any decisions based on its contents. Who are you? She said. Someone who has been aware of your activities for longer than you might expect, Captain. and someone who would prefer that this morning's conversation remain between us. A pause. General Reed is a good officer. He acts on good intentions. But there are people above General Reed whose intentions are more complicated, and those people have concerns about the kind of institutional visibility this program would create around activities that have up to now been managed with appropriate discretion. Sarah's jaw tightened. Managed with appropriate discretion. That was a phrase she had heard before in different forms. It was the phrase that organizations used when they meant that something useful had been done by someone they weren't prepared to officially acknowledge. You're telling me, she said, that the people who benefited from what I did in the field don't want a program that would require them to explain how I was doing it. I'm telling you, the voice said, that the situation is complicated. It's not that complicated, Sarah said. You used me, and now you want to make sure that the record doesn't reflect that. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, I'd encourage you to think carefully about your next steps, Captain. The meeting with General Reed yesterday was noted. The people I represent are not hostile to you, but they are watching. The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the folder on her table. Then she stood up, put on her uniform, and drove to base. At 0730, she walked into Reed's temporary office without knocking. Foster, the aide, started to rise from his desk. She said, "I need 5 minutes with the general," and kept walking. Reed was on the phone. He looked up when she entered. He said, "I'll call you back," and hung up. He looked at her expression and said, "Sit down." "Someone called me this morning," she said. She sat. "Private number. They knew about the folder. They told me the program won't receive final authorization." Reed's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes went very still. "What else did they say?" "That my activities have been managed with appropriate discretion. That the people who authorized what I was doing in the field are concerned about institutional visibility." She paused. "They were polite. That made it worse." Reed was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the desk. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly. They said they were watching." "Okay," Reed said. He said it the way people say it when they mean the opposite. Not okay, not resolved, but acknowledged and now being handled. He stood. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for about 10 seconds, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that he was doing the same thing she did at the firing line, controlling something, holding something very still inside himself, while he decided how to respond. He turned around. "There are 3 people above me who would have the authority to block this program at the authorization stage," he said. "One of them I trust completely. One of them I have a complicated relationship with, and one of them," he stopped. "Let me make some calls. They'll know you're making calls." "Yes," Reed said, "they will." He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Hiding is how I've operated for 17 years. I'm done with that." Reed almost smiled again. "Good," he said, "because I'm going to need you to be visible. Specifically, I'm going to need you to be at a briefing at 1400 hours today with a room full of people who are going to have opinions about yesterday's events on Range 7. "What kind of briefing?" "The kind where Darren Howell has requested a formal review of your presence on the range and the validity of your qualification shot." Reed picked up his phone. He filed his complaint at 0600 this morning. Fastest he's ever done anything in his career. Sarah absorbed this. "Who's running the review?" "Colonel Patricia Wen, JAG. She's thorough, she's fair, and she has no relationship with Howell." Reed paused. "She does, however, follow procedures exactly, which means you'll need to account for every aspect of how you were on that range, how your credentials were cleared, and how your rifle was transported on base." "My credentials were legitimately cleared," Sarah said. "The range sergeant checked them. Your rifle is the issue. You transported a non-issued personally modified weapon in a private vehicle onto a military installation and used it during what was technically an official qualification event." Sarah looked at him. "I see. The regulation isn't ambiguous," Reed said. "You broke it." "I know," Sarah said. "I broke it knowingly." Reed looked at her. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the right weapon for a 4,000-meter shot in those conditions is the one I've been building and calibrating for 11 years. Any other rifle, and I might have missed. And if I'd missed, none of this would be happening. She paused. I made a calculation, sir, the way I always do. Reed held her gaze for a long moment. Wen is going to ask you that exact question. Make sure your answer is as clear as it was just now. At 9:15, Kowalski found her in the logistics building. He appeared at the door of her office with his cover in his hand and the expression of a man who has been thinking hard about something since the previous day and has finally decided to do something about it. Got a minute, he said. Yes, she said. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the way that big men who are used to being in uncomfortable situations stand solid balanced, not going anywhere. I heard about Howell's complaint, he said. Word moves fast on a base this size. It does, Sarah agreed. I want to testify at the review, he said. Me and two of my guys. We were on that line. We saw everything. I want to go on record about what we saw. He paused. I also want to go on record about the shot. Because if Wen is reviewing whether your qualification result is valid, she needs to hear from people who understand what a 4,000-meter confirmed hit means in real terms, not just a number on a sensor readout. Sarah looked at him. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, Kowalski said with a trace of impatience that was entirely genuine. I want to. There's a difference, Captain. You of all people should know that. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the movies, but the small, real way that things shift when you realize that you've been alone with something for a long time and you're suddenly unexpectedly not alone with it anymore. Thank you, Chief, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Howell has friends on this base, and whoever called you this morning, that's not going away. No, Sarah said, it's not. Kowalski put his cover back on. He was almost at the door when he stopped and turned back. One more thing, he said. The guys on my team, the ones who were laughing yesterday. He stopped. Two of them came to me this morning and asked if they could be part of whatever training program comes out of this. He paused. I thought you should know that. She nodded. I appreciate that. He left. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her supply manifest, the corrected one, the one with the rerouted communications equipment, now properly tracked, and finished her morning work. Because the supply chain didn't stop moving, because her life was changing shape. The equipment still needed to be where it was supposed to be. That discipline, the refusal to let one part of life collapse while another part was under pressure, was something she had learned so early that she couldn't remember learning it. It was just part of how she was built. At 1300 hours, she walked to the building where the review was being held. Wen's team had set up in a conference room on the second floor, a clean institutional space with a long table and too many chairs and a digital display at one end that no one had turned on. Colonel Patricia Wen was already there when Sarah arrived. She was 50 compact with the organized precision of someone who had spent a career making sure that the law was applied exactly as written. No more and no less. She looked up when Sarah entered and said, Captain Langford, thank you for being on time. Yes, ma'am. Sit anywhere. We're waiting for Colonel Howell and 2 additional parties. Sarah sat. She placed her hands on the table in front of her and waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent 17 years waiting for conditions to be right, for intelligence to be verified for the moment when action was the correct response, and not a second before. Howell arrived 4 minutes later. He had 2 people with him, a JAG captain Sarah didn't recognize and a civilian she had never seen on base before. The civilian was somewhere in his 50s in a suit that was too good for Fort Carver, with a specific kind of unremarkable face that certain kinds of powerful people cultivate deliberately. He sat without being introduced. Sarah looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Wen. Let's begin, Wen said. This is a preliminary review, not a formal hearing. No findings will be issued today. The purpose is to establish a clear factual record of events on Range 7 yesterday, including the question of Captain Langford's authorization to be present and to discharge a weapon during the qualification event. She looked at Sarah. Captain, I'd like to start with you. In your own words, please describe your decision to go to Range 7 yesterday. Sarah began to speak. She was precise and she was thorough and she did not hedge. She described the radio traffic she had heard. She described her credentials, which were legitimate. She described her decision to bring her rifle, and she described it with exactly the same words she had used with Reed. She had made a calculation. The calculation was that no other rifle would give her the shot she needed, and she had been right. Howell interrupted twice. Both times Wen stopped him with a calm, "Please let the captain finish, Colonel." When Sarah finished, Wen made notes. Then she looked at the civilian. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, which was the first time anyone had used his name. "You've requested the opportunity to speak to the matter of the weapon. You may proceed." Caldwell looked at Sarah. His expression was neutral in the way that deliberately cultivated neutral expressions are not naturally neutral, but deliberately so, which meant there was something under it being managed. "Captain Langford," he said, "I want to be clear that nothing said in this room is intended to diminish what you demonstrated on Range 7 yesterday. Your skill is not in question." "Then what is in question, Mr. Caldwell?" Sarah said. "A beat. Just a small one." He hadn't expected her to ask it that directly. "The chain of authority under which you've been operating," he said carefully. "Your deployments to Afghanistan, the nature of your activities there. These things exist in a space that requires clarity." "I've been clear about my activities when asked by the appropriate authority," Sarah said. "I spoke to General Reed yesterday. I'll speak to whatever official inquiry is properly convened." "This review," Caldwell said, "may expand in scope." "That's fine," Sarah said. She looked at him steadily. "I have nothing to hide. I have things I've been prevented from making visible. Those are different." Something moved across Caldwell's face. It was brief, and it wasn't fear exactly, but it was in the same neighborhood as fear, the expression of a man who has just understood that the person across from him is not going to be managed, that the levers he thought he had don't reach. Wen was watching all of this. She was writing notes, and Sarah was watching her write them, and she noticed that Wen's pen had not slowed during her exchange with Caldwell. Wen was getting all of it down. Every word. That was when Kowalski and his two men walked in. They had been outside in the hallway. Wen looked up. Kowalski said, "Colonel Wen, I've submitted a formal request to provide testimony to this review. I believe your aide has the paperwork." Wen looked at her aide, who nodded. She looked at Kowalski. "Chief Petty Officer Kowalski, sit down." Howell said, "This review was not intended to include Colonel Howell," Wen said with a patience that was clearly practiced. "I determined the scope of this review, not you." She looked at Kowalski. "You'll speak after I've finished with Captain Langford." Howell's face had gone a specific shade of tight that Sarah recognized as a man running out of moves. He had filed the complaint expecting a process he could manage. He had gotten Patricia Wen, who managed her own processes, and Kowalski, who had shown up with witnesses, and a captain who answered direct questions with direct answers and didn't look away from anyone in the room. It wasn't going the way he had planned. And then the moment that nobody in the room had been prepared for, the door opened again. Reed's aide Foster stood in the doorway. He said, "Colonel Wen, I apologize for the interruption. General Reed has asked me to deliver a document to this review." He held out a folder. Wen's aide took it to her. She opened it. She read the first page. Her expression didn't change. She was too professional for that, but her pen stopped moving for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked up. She looked at Caldwell first, then at Howell, then at Sarah. "General Reed," she said with great evenness, "has submitted to this review a declassification request for Captain Langford's operational record in Afghanistan, including mission logs, authorization chains, and outcome assessments for all confirmed engagements." She paused. "He has also submitted a letter of commendation for those operations signed by himself and countersigned by 2 additional flag officers." The silence in the room had a texture to it. Howell's face had gone past tight and into something that was close to pale. Caldwell was very still, and the thing he was managing under his neutral expression had gotten considerably heavier. Sarah sat at the table with her hands flat in front of her and looked at nothing in particular and breathed. In, out. Because she had not known about the declassification request. Reed had not told her. He had simply done it, had spent the morning making the phone calls he said he was going to make, and this was what those calls had produced. He had not asked for her permission to make her visible. He had simply decided that she deserved to be. For the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, Sarah Langford did not know exactly what was coming next. She had spent 17 years in perfect control of her variables, her position, her angles, her calculations, the information she released, and the information she held. And now sitting in a conference room at Fort Carver, While a JAG colonel read General Reed's words out loud, the variables were out of her hands. She found to her surprise that she could live with that. She breathed out. She let her shoulders settle. She waited for whatever was coming next. Outside, across the installation, Range 7 was empty in the afternoon heat. The target at 4,000 meters stood in the same position it had stood in yesterday. The hole through its center was still there, clean, precise, exactly where she had put it, and it wasn't going anywhere. Neither was she. The review session broke at 16:40 without a finding. One had been precise about that. She closed her folder, and said that the record would be compiled, that the declassification request would need to move through proper channels before any operational material could be formally entered, and that all parties would be notified when a follow-up session was scheduled. She said it with the same calibrated evenness she had maintained for the entire 2 hours. And nobody in the room could read her face well enough to know which direction she was leaning. Caldwell left first. He didn't say anything on his way out. He didn't look at Sarah. He moved through the door with the focused efficiency of a man who had phone calls to make and didn't want to waste time on anything that wasn't those phone calls. Howell left second. He paused at the door just for a moment, just long enough to look back at Sarah with an expression that had given up on being neutral and settled into something that was simply cold. Then he was gone. Kowalski stood up from his chair and stretched his neck. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that was something." "Yes," Wen said without looking up from her notes. "It was." Sarah gathered nothing because she had brought nothing. She stood. She looked at Wen. "Colonel," she said, "thank you for the process." Wen looked up. Her expression for the first time all afternoon had something human in it, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The look of one professional acknowledging another. "Captain Langford," she said, "I'll tell you this off the record. The declassification request Reed submitted, the counter-signatures on that letter are not insignificant. Whatever happens next, the people who wanted this quiet are going to find that considerably harder now." Sarah nodded. "I understand." "Go home," Wen said. "Get some sleep. This isn't over, but tonight there's nothing more to do." Sarah walked out. Kowalski fell into step beside her in the hallway without being asked. His two men followed a few paces behind, respectful, quiet, present, in the way that people who understand operational situations are present when someone might need backup they haven't requested. "You knew Reed was going to do that," Kowalski said. "No," Sarah said. He looked at her sideways. "You're not surprised." "I'm surprised," she said. "I'm just not showing it." He almost smiled. "Yeah, I've noticed you do that." They walked to the building exit. Outside, the temperature had dropped as the sun moved lower. Sarah stopped on the steps and breathed the cooler air. Behind her, she could feel Kowalski and his men stop as well, giving her space but not leaving. "Chief," she said without turning around. "The two men who came to you this morning, the ones who asked about the training program." "Yeah." "What made them change their minds?" A pause. Kowalski considered the question honestly, the way he considered everything. "Because they spent last night thinking about what they saw," he said. "A shot at 4,000 meters in those conditions is one thing. Watching someone make that shot with the kind of—" He paused, finding the word. "Quietness. The kind of quietness you had doing it. That's different. That's not just skill. That's something that takes a very long time to build." He paused again. "And I think they started asking themselves why they'd spent any part of yesterday laughing." Sarah turned around. She looked at him. "Tell them I appreciate it," she said. "And tell them the answer is yes. If the program gets authorized, I want people who are genuinely willing to learn. I don't care about their previous opinions." Kowalski nodded. "Understood." She drove home. She made dinner, actual dinner, not the coffee and granola bars that had been most of her nutrition for the past 24 hours. And she sat at her kitchen table with Reed's folder and her own notebook, and she worked through the program structure the way she worked through ballistics problems. Methodically, variable by variable. She worked until midnight. Then she went to sleep. At 0500, her phone rang again. She was awake before the second ring. Private number. She answered it. "Captain Langford." "Captain." Different voice from yesterday morning. Female, older, with a quality to it that Sarah immediately placed as the voice of someone who had spent decades at levels of authority where tone was a precision instrument. "My name is Lieutenant General Harriet Voss. I believe you've heard of me." Sarah sat up. She had heard of Harriet Voss the way everyone in the Army had heard of Harriet Voss, the way you hear about weather systems and tectonic events. Voss was the Deputy Army Chief of Staff for Operations. She had been one of the first women to command a division in a combat theater. She was 63 years old, and she had a reputation for two things: absolute precision and zero tolerance for institutional cowardice. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "I've heard of you." "Good. Then I'll be brief. I've been aware of your file for approximately 4 years. I became more directly aware of it yesterday evening when Marcus Reed called me." A pause. "He told me about the shot. He told me about the review. He told me about Caldwell." Another pause. "He also told me about Kunar Province in 2017, which is something I have my own perspective on because I was the officer who approved the operational parameters for that engagement." Sarah was very still. Captain Voss said, "I want to be honest with you. When your team was used in the eastern sector, the authorization chain was deliberately constructed to be difficult to trace. That was a decision made above my level, and I implemented it because I was asked to and because I believed at the time that it protected the mission. I have had occasion to revisit that judgment." She paused. "I would like the opportunity to revisit it with you directly. I'm going to be at Fort Carver the day after tomorrow. I'd like 2 hours of your time." Sarah processed this for a moment. The woman who had even indirectly, even through layers of authorization and distance, sent Thomas Okafor and James Ritter and Derek Baines and Luis Espinosa into a choke point on bad intelligence, was on the phone asking for 2 hours. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "what is the purpose of the meeting?" "Several purposes," Voss said. "One is personal, one is institutional, and one, a pause that felt deliberate. One concerns a decision that's going to be made in the next 72 hours about the program Reed has proposed and about your operational record and about what the Army is going to officially say happened in Kunar Province in February of 2017. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "What is the Army going to say?" "That depends in part on what you wanted to say," Voss said, "and what you're willing to put your name on." She paused. "I'll see you at 0900 day after tomorrow, Captain. My aide will send the location." The call ended. Sarah set the phone down on her nightstand and sat in the dark for a moment. Then she got up, went to the kitchen and made coffee. It was 5:12 in the morning. She was not going back to sleep. At 0700, she sent Reed a message through official channels. Brief, professional, the kind of message that could be read by anyone without revealing anything significant. She said she had received a call she needed to discuss. He responded within 6 minutes. 0800 his office. She was there at 0758. Reed looked like he had also been awake for a while. He was in full uniform, but there was a quality to his alertness, a slight over-precision to his movements, that told her he was running on discipline rather than rest. He waved her to the chair without preamble. "Voss called you," he said. "Yes, sir, 0500. She called me at 0430. He sat. "She moves fast when she decides to move." "She said the decision about the program is going to be made in 72 hours, Sarah said. "And she said it depends on what I'm willing to put my name on." "Yes." Reed folded his hands on the desk. "Here's what I know about what's being decided. Caldwell and the people he represents want the operational record to remain sealed. They want a version of the story in which you are a logistics officer who made a remarkable shot on a qualification range and who has been assigned as a result to a supplemental training role in her current MOS. No reclassification, no formal acknowledgement of the Afghanistan operations, no declassification." Sarah looked at him. "And the training program? Reduced, a 1-week skills course, not a 12-week program. No independent directorate, no budget line of its own." He paused. "Cosmetic." She was quiet for a moment. "And what does Voss want?" "Voss wants the full record," Reed said. "She wants the declassification, the formal commendation the program as I designed it, and a public acknowledgement that the Army used personnel in operational roles without formal recognition, and that this is being corrected." He paused. "She also wants to give you the Bronze Star with Valor for Kunar Province, the February operation you're for, and for what you did for my team in September. The Bronze Star with Valor." Sarah had not thought about the Bronze Star. She had not in 17 years allowed herself to think about official recognition in terms that concrete, because concrete things could be taken away, and she had built her life on things she could control. But it sat there in the middle of Reed's sentence, and it had weight, and that weight had the specific gravity of 4 names: Thomas Okafor, James Ritter, Derek Baines, Luis Espinoza. Men who had never been officially recognized for what they had done or what had happened to them. Men whose families had been given explanations that were true in the narrowest possible sense and deeply false in every way that mattered. Their families, Sarah said. Reed looked at her. He knew immediately what she meant. Yes, he said. If the record is opened, their families get the full accounting. What those men were doing, why they were there, what they were trying to accomplish. He paused. And how they died, not the version that was given. Sarah's jaw tightened. She breathed. What version were their families given? Reed held her questions. Training accident, he said quietly. Non-combat incident during a logistics support exercise. The words moved through her like something cold. She had not known that. She had known the families hadn't been told the truth, but she hadn't known what they had been told instead. Training accident, non-combat. As if Thomas Okafor hadn't died in an ambush that he had walked into because someone above both of them had approved bad intelligence without double-checking the source. As if Luis Espinoza hadn't died doing something that required a level of courage that most people would not be able to locate in themselves under any circumstances. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Reed and breathed for approximately 15 seconds. She was not going to lose her composure in this office. She was going to feel what she was feeling, and then she was going to bring it back under control, because losing control right now served no one, not herself, not Reed, and not 4 men who deserved a great deal better than a training accident notation in a sealed file. She turned around. I will meet with Voss, she said, and I'll put my name on whatever needs my name on it. Reed nodded. He said nothing else, which was exactly right. At 1400 hours, her radio crackled. Reeves. Captain, you have got a visitor at the logistics building. Chief Kowalski. She walked back. Kowalski was waiting outside her office door with the same solid balanced stance he'd had yesterday. He had someone with him, one of the SEAL candidates from Range 7. Young, maybe 24, with the kind of face that was still deciding what it was going to look like when it finished settling into adulthood. He was standing very straight in a way that suggested he was nervous and working hard not to show it. This is Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Webb, Kowalski said. Sarah looked at him. The name moved through her like a current. Webb, she said. Yes, ma'am, the young man said. His voice was steady, but just barely. Thomas Webb was my uncle. The hallway outside her office was quiet. Reeves had wisely found somewhere else to be. Sarah looked at Aaron Webb at his age, at his face, at the deliberate straightness of his posture, and understood in an instant the full weight of this moment. Thomas Webb, who had died 11 days after Kunar Province at Bagram Hospital, had a nephew who was now a SEAL candidate who had been on Range 7 yesterday and had stood in the group of men who had not yet moved forwards to shake her hand. Come inside, she said. She held the door open. He came in. Kowalski followed. They sat. Sarah sat across from them. She did not wait for Webb to arrange his words. She could see him doing that, could see the effort of a young man trying to find the correct formal way to say something that was not a formal thing. I know who you are, he said. I mean, I didn't know yesterday. But last night, Chief Kowalski told me about Kunar Province, about what you did, about my uncle. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. My family was told it was a training accident. I know, Sarah said. I found out this morning. Something moved across his face, surprised, and something more complicated. You didn't know either. No, she said. I knew the official record didn't reflect the truth. I didn't know what they had been told instead. He was quiet for a moment. My aunt, his wife, she blamed herself for a long time. She thought if she'd asked him to leave the army sooner, if she'd pushed harder, he'd have been home doing something safe. His voice stayed steady. She thought he died on a routine exercise. She thought it was random, like it didn't mean anything. Sarah held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not soften what she was about to say, because she had learned that the truth said plainly and with respect was almost always kinder than the careful version. Your uncle was in Kunar Province because he believed in what he was doing, she said. He was competent and he was brave, and he made choices that required both of those things simultaneously. What happened to him was not random. It was the consequence of decisions made above both of us that should have been made differently. And he deserved to have that said clearly to his family a long time ago. Aaron Webb blinked once. His jaw tightened. He nodded very slowly. That's what I needed to hear, he said. Not I wanted to hear, needed. The difference between those two words in that moment was enormous. There's a process beginning, Sarah said, that may result in the official record being corrected. I can't make promises about timelines, but I can tell you that I am going to do everything in my capacity to make sure that your uncle's family gets the truth. I know, he said. Chief Kowalski told me. He paused. That's actually not the only reason I'm here. He straightened slightly. I want to be in the program, ma'am. If it gets authorized, I want to train under you. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the age in his face and the determination behind it and the grief that was sitting quietly in the background of both of those things, the way grief does when you've been living with it long enough to have made a kind of peace with it being there. Do you understand what the program involves, she said. Long-range marksmanship, mathematics, patience. He paused. Chief Kowalski said you told your recruits that the shot is the last thing, that everything before the shot is what actually matters. She hadn't said that to Kowalski in those exact words, but it was accurate. It was, in fact, the clearest summary of everything she had spent 17 years learning. That's correct, she said. Then yes, he said. I understand what it involves. She looked at him for a long moment. Kowalski was watching her. Not Webb, and his expression was neutral, in the genuine way, not managed, just waiting. When the program is authorized, Sarah said, put in your application. Webb exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried everything in it. He stood. He shook her hand properly, firmly. Thank you, Captain. After they left, Sarah sat alone in her office for a few minutes. The supply manifest on her desk was finished. The communications equipment was located and rerouted. The formal review was pending. The meeting with Voss was scheduled. The program proposal was in a folder she had nearly memorized. Everything that could be done today had been done. She picked up her pen. She opened her personal notebook. Not the ballistics notebook, a different one, older with a plain brown cover, and she turned to a page near the back. 4 names were written there in her handwriting in ink that was 7 years old. Thomas Okafor, James Ritter, Derek Baines, Luis Espinoza. She had written them the week she came home. She had not written anything else on that page because she hadn't known what else to write. There was nothing adequate. Below Luis Espinoza's name, she wrote one line. She wrote it slowly with the same precision she brought to every calculation. She wrote, their families will know the truth. She closed the notebook. She put the pen down. She sat in the quiet of her office and let herself feel the full weight of the past 48 hours, not to wallow in it, not to perform it, but because feeling things accurately was also a kind of precision, and she had never believed in cutting corners on anything that mattered. Then she picked up the supply manifest and started reviewing it one more time, because the work didn't stop. It never had. That was the thing about being the person she was. There were always 2 jobs to do, and she had never, not once in 17 years, let one of them slide because the other one was hard. She was still at her desk at 1900 hours when her phone buzzed. A message from Reed's aide Foster. It said, Voss has moved the meeting, 0700 day after tomorrow. She says come ready to make decisions. Sarah read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and went back to her manifests. She had decisions to make in 40 hours. Until then, the equipment needed to be tracked. The numbers needed to be right. She had never been late on either count. She wasn't going to start now. Lieutenant General Harriet Voss arrived at Fort Carver at 0645, 15 minutes early. Sarah had been in the conference room since 0620, which meant that when Voss walked in, the first thing she saw was a woman already seated, already still with a notebook open in front of her and a pen resting beside it. Not performing readiness, actually ready. Voss stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 second. Then she came in, set her own folder on the table, and sat directly across from Sarah, without any of the ambient noise that senior officers sometimes generated around themselves, the aides repositioning furniture, the quiet consultations, the arrangement of authority and physical space. She had one aide who closed the door from the outside and stayed there. She was 63. She had a face that had been serious for a long time, and the seriousness had become structural, built into the way she held her jaw, the way her eyes moved across a room, taking inventory. She looked at Sarah the way Sarah looked at targets, with complete attention. "You were early," Voss said. "Yes, ma'am." "Good habit." She opened her folder. "I'm going to say something personal before we go into the substance of this meeting, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Yes, ma'am." Voss looked at her directly. "In 2017, I signed off on operational parameters that put your team in a position they should not have been in. I did not design those parameters. I was not the officer who approved the intelligence assessment that was wrong, but I signed the authorization, and that means my name is on what happened in that choke point in February." She paused. "I have thought about that a great deal over the past 7 years. I have not thought about it as abstractly as the institution would prefer. I have thought about it as a woman who sent people into a situation without adequate safeguards, and 4 of them didn't come home." She stopped. "I'm sorry, Captain. That is not a sufficient thing to say, but it is a true thing, and I needed to say it to you in person." The room was very quiet. Sarah had prepared herself for many versions of this meeting. She had not prepared herself for this version, for a lieutenant general sitting across a table and saying, "I'm sorry," without hedging it, without qualifying it, without folding it inside institutional language that would make it easier to manage. She sat with it for a moment. She let it be what it was. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Her voice was even. "That matters." Voss nodded once. Then she turned the page in her folder, and the meeting shifted into its second register faster, more precise the way conversations move when 2 people have decided to trust each other and are working against a clock. "Here is what is being decided in the next 48 hours, Voss said. "Option 1, Caldwell's version, sealed record, reduced training role, no reclassification. The story that is told is a remarkable shot on a qualification range, and that's where it ends." She looked up. "Option 2, full declassification of your operational record. Formal reclassification to special operations instructor. The program as Reed designed it. And a public correction to the official record on the 4 men you lost with personal notification to their families." "And the Bronze Star," Sarah said. "And the Bronze Star," Voss confirmed, "with valor for both operations." Sarah looked at her notebook, at the open page which was blank because she had not written anything yet, because she had come into this meeting wanting to hear the full shape of it before she put anything on paper. "What does Caldwell have that makes option 1 viable?" she said. "Because if the declassification request is already submitted and countersigned by 2 flag officers, the path to sealing it again has to go through someone significant." Voss almost smiled. It was brief, and it was the kind of smile that acknowledged the quality of a question without making it a compliment. "Caldwell has a sitting member of the Senate Armed Services Committee who is concerned that full disclosure of how your team was used will open questions about 3 other operations that ran in the same period under similar authorization structures. Operations that are still active," Sarah said. "One of them," Voss said. "Yes." Sarah processed that. The chessboard of it, the full geometry of who was protecting what and why. One active operation whose existence could not be publicly connected to the authorization chain that had also produced her team. That was the real lock on the door. Not Howell, not even Caldwell. A senator and a live operation and the institutional instinct to protect both of them by keeping everything quiet, including 4 names that deserve to be said out loud. "Is there a way," Sarah said slowly, "to declassify my record and the record of my 4 without exposing the active operation?" Voss looked at her steadily. "That is exactly the right question," she said, "and the answer is yes. But it requires a surgical declassification specific mission, logs, specific outcome records, specific authorization documents of which can be released without touching the operational details of the other 3 programs." She paused. "It requires someone in JAG with the expertise to draft the specific classification exceptions, and it requires my signature and Reed's signature and the signature of one more flag officer who is willing to put their name on it." She paused again. "I have the 3rd signature. I obtained it this morning." Sarah looked up. "Who?" General Diane Park, Voss said. "Army Chief of Staff." The name landed in the room with the weight of something final. Diane Park was the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army. Her signature on a declassification order didn't just open doors, it closed the conversation about whether those doors should be opened. It made the decision institutionally irreversible. Sarah sat very still. "The Chief of Staff," she said. "Marcus Reed made a phone call 2 nights ago," Voss said. "He is persuasive when he chooses to be. And Park has her own history with the way women have been used in operational roles without formal recognition. She did not need a great deal of persuading." Voss folded her hands on the table. "Captain Langford, the decision that remains is yours. The document is drafted. The signatures are ready. What has to happen now is that you sign a statement confirming your operational activities and consenting to the declassification of your record." Sarah looked at the blank page in her notebook. She looked at the pen beside it. She thought about 17 years. She thought about the first time she had taught herself to calculate bullet drop from a library book, checked out on a card that still had her college student information on it. She thought about the first shot she had ever fired at genuine distance, 500 meters of range in New Mexico, a Tuesday in October. The sound of the impact arriving back to her a moment after she'd already known it was on target. She thought about Afghanistan and the cold and the patience of waiting for exactly the right moment, and the weight of knowing that if she was wrong, people died. She thought about a choke point in February and an explosion she had heard from an elevated position and 4 names she had written in a notebook by hand and ink that was 7 years old. She thought about Aaron Webb, 24 years old, standing very straight in a hallway outside her office. She picked up her pen. "Where do I sign?" she said. Voss turned the folder around and slid it across the table. Sarah read it. She read every page, not quickly, not as a formality, but with the same methodical attention she brought to every document that had operational significance. It took 11 minutes. Voss waited without speaking, without shifting in her chair, without doing any of the things that people do when they are impatient and trying not to show it. She simply waited. When Sarah reached the last page, she read the signature block. She read the names already on it. Reed, Voss, Park. 3 signatures that represented between them something like the institutional conscience of the United States Army, saying this was not right and we are correcting it. She signed her name. She dated it. She set the pen down. Voss took the folder back. "It will be processed today," she said. "Families will be notified within 48 hours. Your reclassification orders will be cut within the week. The program begins formal planning in 30 days. She paused. "And Colonel Wynn's review will be closed with a finding of no violation. The weapon issue has been addressed through a retroactive authorization that was processed this morning." Sarah looked at her. "Howell." "Howell is being reassigned," Voss said. Her voice was completely flat. "Fort Wainwright, Alaska. He received the orders at 0600. She paused. He did not take it well. Sarah said nothing. She did not feel satisfaction about Howell's reassignment. She didn't feel nothing about it either. She felt something that was honest and complicated, the recognition that a person who had spent years making himself an obstacle to other people's dignity had finally encountered a structure that was larger than his obstruction. That was not satisfaction. It was closer to relief, the kind of relief that arrives not when something good happens, but when something unjust finally stops. "Caldwell," she said. "Caldwell has been informed that the declassification will proceed," Voss said. "His concerns about the active operation have been addressed through the surgical approach you identified." A pause. "He is unhappy. He is also without recourse. When the Army Chief of Staff signs a document, the window for being unhappy about it is very small." At 09:15, the meeting ended. Voss stood. She extended her hand across the table. Sarah stood and shook it. The handshake was brief and firm, and it meant exactly what it appeared to mean: 2 people who had been on opposite sides of a serious failure, finding their way to the same side of correcting it. "One more thing," Voss said at the door. She turned back. "The program Reed designed, I read it last night, all of it. The curriculum structure, the cohort model, the progression from fundamentals to extreme range." She paused. "The section on field decision-making under communication failure. Who wrote that section?" "I did," Sarah said. Voss nodded. "It's the best written piece of tactical instruction I've read in a decade," she said. "Don't let anyone water it down." Then she was gone. Sarah stood in the conference room alone for a moment. Then she walked out down the hallway, out of the building and across the installation toward logistics. She had work to do. She would always have work to do. That was not going to change just because everything else was changing. Kowalski found her at 1100. He walked into her office with the same directness he always used, which she had come to realize was one of the things she genuinely respected about him. He never built up to things. Words already moving, he said, about the declassification, about the reclassification, about Howell. He sat. How are you doing? She thought about the question. I'm processing, she said. That's not an answer. No, she agreed, it's not. She set down her pen. I'm in unfamiliar territory. I have spent 17 years knowing exactly where the edges of my situation were, where I was visible and where I wasn't, what I could claim and what I couldn't. She paused. And now the edges have changed and I'm recalibrating. That takes time, Kowalski said. Yes, she said. It does. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth from the outside, you look the same as you did on range 7. Like someone who already knows where the target is. Like someone who's just waiting for the conditions to be right. She looked at him. The conditions are right, she said. That's the strange part. I've been waiting for the conditions to be right for 17 years and now they are. And it's, she stopped. Disorienting, Kowalski said. Yes. He nodded. He understood that. She could see that he understood it, that he had his own version of that specific disorientation. The version that arrives when the thing you've been fighting toward is suddenly no longer in front of you but underneath you, and you have to find your footing on different ground. At 1400, she got the call she had been waiting for without letting herself know she had been waiting for it. It was a number she didn't recognize, a civilian number area code she placed as Virginia. She answered. Captain Langford. A woman's voice, older, careful. Yes, Sarah said. My name is Helen Webb. I was Thomas Webb's wife. A pause. I received a call this morning from a General Voss. She told me some things about what Thomas was doing, about what happened. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that is built over a long grief, not the absence of one. She said you were there. Sarah closed her office door. She sat down. She held the phone with both hands. Yes, she said. I was there. She said you tried to protect him. Helen Webb's voice shifted, not breaking, but moving through something. She said you were the reason the other 5 men came home. I did everything I could, Sarah said. The sentence was simple, and it was true, and it was inadequate, and she said it anyway because inadequate truths were still truths. I've spent 7 years, Helen Webb said, believing my husband died doing nothing. Believing it was random, pointless. She stopped. It wasn't pointless, was it? No, Sarah said. It was never pointless. Thomas was there because he chose to be there doing something he believed in alongside people he trusted. And he was effective and he was brave, and the world is different because of what he and his team were doing. She paused. I'm sorry he didn't come home. I'm sorry you were not told the truth. You should have been told the truth from the beginning. Silence on the line, a long silence. Then Helen Webb said, would you, when this is all official, would you be willing to talk to me more, tell me more about what he did? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. I'll tell you everything I'm permitted to tell you, and I'll advocate for every additional detail to be cleared. She paused. You deserve all of it. Helen Webb said, thank you. It was 2 words and they carried 7 years of weight behind them. And Sarah received them the way she had received everything in the past 4 days, directly without deflecting, letting them land where they were aimed. The call lasted 23 more minutes. When it ended, Sarah sat quietly for a while. She was not crying. She was not performing composure. She was simply present with the full reality of what had just happened. A window that had been closed for 7 years had just opened, and the light coming through it was complicated and real and necessary. At 1600, Bart Reed appeared at her office door. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway the way he'd stood on range 7 2 days ago, evaluating, measuring, deciding. It's done, he said. I know, she said. Voss's office confirmed at 1540. He nodded. Program planning meeting in 30 days. I want you in the room from day 1. He paused. Not as a consultant, as the architect. Understood, she said. He started to leave. Then he stopped, turned back and said something she hadn't expected. I looked up your range records, he said. The ones from the civilian ranges you've been using off base. The ones you shot on your own, with your own equipment, on your own time for 17 years. He paused. Do you know what your average deviation was at 4,000 meters across all recorded sessions? She knew. She had calculated it herself many times. 12 centimeters, she said. 12 centimeters, Reed repeated. At 4 kilometers, consistently, over hundreds of shots. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in something that was closer to reckoning. We missed you, he said. The Army missed you. For 17 years we missed you. And I need you to know that I understand what that cost. Not just you, what it cost. She held his gaze. The program will make sure we don't miss the next one, she said. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, it will. He nodded once, not a salute, just a nod, the kind between people who have reached an understanding, and walked away. 3 weeks later, and Sarah stood on Range 7 for the first time since the qualification event. She had requested the range for 2 hours in the early morning before any other scheduled activity. She came alone. She set up at the firing line with her rifle, her own rifle in its worn olive drab case, and she went through her preparations the way she always did. Wind, temperature, humidity, the math, the mechanics, the patience. She took one shot. She waited the 4+ seconds. The range sensor confirmed center mass impact. She packed up her rifle. She closed the case. She stood at the firing line and looked out across the 4,000 meters of desert between her and the target. She thought about Thomas Okafor and James Ritter and Derek Baines and Luis Espinoza. She thought about them clearly and fully, the way she always did, their faces, their voices, the specific quality of their courage, the specific injustice of their erasure, and the ongoing work of their recovery. She did not say anything out loud. She didn't need to. She had already said what needed to be said in conference rooms, on phone calls, in a notebook, in a signature, on a document that had the Army Chief of Staff's name above hers. The saying had been done. What remained now was the doing. In 30 days, the first planning meeting for the program would take place. In 90 days, the first cohort of candidates would arrive. They would be young, some of them younger than she had been when she checked out that library book and started teaching herself the mathematics of extreme range. They would arrive with skills and with confidence, and with, in some cases, the specific blindness that comes from having been told you are already excellent. She was going to dismantle that blindness carefully and rebuild it into something more accurate. She was going to teach them the mathematics first, then the mechanics, then the patience, then the hardest part, the understanding that the shot was the last thing, that everything before the shot was what actually decided whether people came home. She was going to do that for Thomas and James and Derek and Luis. She was going to do it for Aaron Webb, who had already submitted his application. She was going to do it for every person who would one day be in a choke point with bad intelligence, in a jammed radio, and who would look up at an elevated position and find someone there who knew exactly what to do. She picked up her rifle case. She walked off the range. She drove back to base. There was a planning document on her desk that needed finishing. She had 3 weeks to get it right, and she intended to get it exactly right, because getting things exactly right was not a preference for Sarah Langford. It was a standard she had set for herself at 21 years old, alone on a range in New Mexico, with a library book and a borrowed rifle, and the absolute unshakable conviction that precision was not something the world owed you. It was something you built on your own, one shot at a time, until the day someone finally gave you a room in which to teach it. That day had come. She was not going to waste a single moment of it.